Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus, and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1970, and we're going to be taking a look at The Who live at the Isle of Wight festival, and they're going to be playing through I Don't Even Know Myself, even though Roger does introduce it as I Don't Know Myself, I think because they'd only just written this, so it's one of the first performances of the track, and they might have changed the title after the fact. But anyway, let's get these guys up on screen and see how they get on.
It's a number called I Don't Know Myself. You know me, 'cause I don't even know myself. I don't know myself. I don't mind if you try once in a while. I don't mind if I cry once in a while. Some shutters tight as they might seem. I'm just trying to fight my way out of this dream. Listen to the words I say, waking up if I'm enlightened. Shiver as you pass me by, 'cause mister, I'm the one who's fighting. The police just came and left. They wanted me and no one else. Don't pretend that you know me, 'cause I don't even know myself. Don't know myself. Once in a while.
I'm just going to jump in here because we've got a good flavour of the performance so far, and the main thing about The Who is just the way that they were all absolutely lead players on every instrument, and I know that's something that gets thrown around, but when you have a look at especially the guy on the drums, Keith Moon, the way that he plays, it is like a lead guitarist or a lead singer playing the drums, because he puts so much effort into the performance, and just the way that even on the breakdown you can see the faces that he's pulling just all the time. Such an entertaining guy he was just to look at while he was playing live. And another thing to look out for is the way that Keith looks over to John, especially when he catches that crash, because he's just getting that tightness with John. They're absolutely on the same page all the time. But it's one of these things that I mention all the time about having a solid foundation in the band. You absolutely need the drummer and the bassist to be on the same page. And of course, John and Keith were absolutely that, just solid the whole way through. And it's interesting just to watch the way that Keith just looks over just to make sure that everything is where it should be, and it always is. And when I mentioned about them being effective lead players on all of their instruments, of course, we've got Roger laying down a fantastic lead vocal here. And back in the early days, he actually started on guitar, but then they decided just to have him out front, and you would definitely agree with that decision, considering the voice that he's got, but also that natural showmanship side to him that he's got as well, throwing the mic around and all the various things that he does to entertain the crowd. And then throwing the attention over to Pete Townsend on guitar as well, because he plays rhythm guitar like a lead guitarist in terms of the amount of expression and the amount of entertainment that he puts into just his rhythm playing. You know, with the windmills and everything we know that he does, having all of that in there there means that he is the focus as well. He's very much making a statement about playing rhythm guitar. So it's really up front in your face and just mighty loud, by the way. I mean, The Who were one of those bands that I think at one of their gigs, it was a Guinness World Record for being 140 decibels, something like that. Just crazy volume. And Pete Townshend, like I said, thrashing out that rhythm. You would definitely know about it if you were in the front row. And the three guys I've just mentioned, Keith Moon, Roger Daltrey and Pete Townshend, were really strong characters in the band, because Roger, of course, was that leader, always wanted everything to be done a particular way. But then when you've got other strong personalities, they can clash. And if you watch this whole gig, you'll get a really good appreciation of the chemistry of the band on stage. And I think it's actually after this track, they have a little conversation between the tracks and they're getting things ready. And Keith says something to Pete, and then Pete says something over the microphone. And it ends up with Pete going over to Keith and kind of slapping him properly. And then Keith gives him evils when Pete then walks back up to the microphone. But then as soon as the music starts, you have a cheeky little grin from Keith and now everything's okay again. But you do see that it's almost like a flashpoint where Pete has hit Keith, but it's really interesting to watch. So I suggest that if you've got time, watch this whole gig, because it's an insight into the band and the relationships between them. And last but definitely not least, we've got John Entwistle on bass. And when I'm talking about lead players, back in the day, their approach really was to have more of a lead on the bass with John and Pete supplying that rhythm guitar. So again, it was something totally unique, a totally different way of doing it, rather than just supplying a standard root note and maybe a fifth now and again on the bass. We've now got a player who's playing lead lines on the instrument. So it really did make the song stand out because we had something different to listen to. And the other thing to mention is the fact that we've got three vocalists here, effectively, because we've got Roger on that lead vocal, but then Pete and John come in with harmony lines, and it makes such a difference to live performance to have that element there. And also the fact that Roger plays harmonica, again, another little part at the beginning of this track that really gives it a different edge. And then when we're talking about keeping the track interesting, the way that Pete writes, because this is one of his tracks, and Roger does introduce it as that, he said this is one that Pete wrote, but he has this tendency to write riffs and write something that's quite heavy, quite hard rock-ish, classic rock certainly, but then he'll totally take it off in a different direction when you're not expecting it. That is definitely the case here. Another one, Behind Blue Eyes, that is another track by Pete. Again, it has just that section that totally is departed from the rest of the track, but makes it interesting as a total change. And let's not underestimate the amount of talent that these guys had independently. Like I said about John playing lead lines on the bass, which was a rare thing in the first place. But then Keith Moon, the way that he could just sell a performance behind a drum kit. And that's so difficult to do because that drum kit is a natural barrier between you and the crowd and the audience. So trying to connect with an audience as a drummer is so difficult, and so few drummers have ever been able to do it. And another thing that the Who had about them was that edge, and that certainly showed itself when they're playing live and smashed up all of their gear live. And I mentioned this in my other The Who video that I did quite a while ago now, where Roger says that every night they were making a huge loss because of the equipment they're destroying. They weren't making that money through the door. So fortunately it worked out okay in the end, but that was all born through them playing in a venue in 1964 where the ceiling was really low, and Pete kind of threw his guitar up and actually smashed his headstock, and everybody in the venue laughed, and this really made Pete quite angry, so he smashed up his guitar and everyone loved it. So they made sure that the next time that they played, Keith then kicked over his drum kit. And it's interesting because at the beginning of the 60s they had a manager called Peter Meaden, and he came up with this idea to try and appeal to mods. And at the time there were mods and rockers, and It was like two different camps. You were either in one or in the other. And Peter had this idea of dressing the band up as mods, and he changed the name of the band to the High Numbers. And they recorded a single, but unfortunately it didn't do particularly well. It didn't even get into the top 50. So the band decided to change their name back to The Who. But I think since that initial move to appeal to mods, it just continued throughout their music and throughout their playing. They did appeal to that crowd, even though they then changed back to The Who. Once they changed back to their original name, things then started to take off once they were known for these gigs in these shows from 1964 onwards. But let's get back into the performance.
I don't mind if I cry once in a while. The doors don't shut as tight as they might seem. I'm just trying to fight my way out of this dream. You know me, 'cause I don't even know myself. Don't know myself. You remember me, I don't remember you. Do you still love me? You know I think you do. Some prison water knows my scream. I'm just trying to fight my way out of this dream. There's only five who know my real name. My mother don't believe they know it. Why she called me is the way I'm staying. No nigga will ever throw it. Come on, all of you big boys. Come on, all of you else. Don't pretend that you know me, 'cause I don't even know myself. Don't know myself. I don't mind if you try once in a while. I don't mind if I cry once in a while.
And there we have it. And I always mention about the top bands, how they all share things in common, and have a little listen through this whole track, the way that they change the dynamics, because it has been written that way. What you'll find is that sometimes when a band's playing and they're elongating a particular track, they might just throw dynamics in there on the fly, whereas this is one of those tracks that has been intentionally written to change that dynamic feel, going from all out to then this really quiet place, and totally changing up the groove and the feel of the track when we go to that other place. The great thing is that because of the mix, we can actually hear John's bass really well, so you can start to hear those guitar lines that are being played on bass, just classic riffs that John would throw in there when Pete is either playing the same riff or just playing rhythm. And the other thing that's evident in this performance is the confidence that everyone has in everybody else's ability. The way that Roger can just go out front and do his thing. Everyone knows that Roger's not going to mess up the vocal, and everyone knows that Keith isn't going to mess up the drums, and Pete's not going to mess up the guitar. John's not going to mess up his bass lines. Everyone is so confident on stage in everyone else's ability. And it's such an important thing to have as a band, to know that you are one tight, cohesive unit, because you're only as strong as your weakest member in a band. And that goes for everything in terms of behind the scenes, rehearsing. If you have got somebody that is weak, that doesn't turn up to rehearsals, doesn't learn the tracks properly, it's a nightmare, because you will go up on stage and somebody will mess up the show. And this is where, when you have top bands and everyone's on the same page, you can see the confidence, and you can see when a band aren't confident in each other's ability, because they're not really interacting very much on stage, because they're all just worried about getting their bit right rather than enjoying the performance and connecting with an audience and putting on a show. They haven't got it down to that level. They're still effectively nervous about their own playing. But The Who are another one of those bands that when you just scratch beneath the surface and look at their live performances, you can see why they've sold over 100 million records, because every one of them is capable of holding your attention by themselves. They don't need to do it as one. Obviously, when they all do it together, that's why it's so great. And then also mentioning about the writing, the fact that Pete would write some songs, but then John also got into writing, and the fact that they wrote in totally different styles. The way that John could go a lot darker with his writing than Pete could, or that Pete wanted to. And then we just quickly mention something that I do say in other videos about bands that have 4 members but get a 3-piece sound. And people say, oh, they're a 4-piece, what are you talking about? I'm talking about having bass, drums and guitar. And in a 3-piece, of course, one of those would supply that lead vocal. And with The Who, we've still got that same setup. It just so happens that Roger is singing. He's out front. But getting a really full sound is so difficult with such limited options in terms of the instruments we've got on stage. And The Who were one of those bands that could absolutely get a great sound live, considering they only really had 1 guitar, 1 bass and a drum kit. So it does happen sometimes that a band that have 4 members and they have that designated lead singer, they don't get the respect or the acknowledgement that they deserve for making the sound behind that singer, because they've got such limited options but still make a great sound. But The Who, just a monster rock band, sold so many records and gave people something different at the time, really did push the boundaries of live performance, putting on a show and really smashing up instruments when they couldn't afford to actually do it. And that is what rock and roll is all about. But thank you so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!